So one day I was watching Pride and Prejudice and I saw this costume and I thought, hey, that shawl is really similar to my favourite scarf. And that's a Georgian men's shirt. I've also got one of those. And I realised since I already had half of this costume, I'd really better make the other half as well. So why am I making this video? I made this costume a couple of years ago now, and I've decided to revisit it for this video. Do you not want to be here? I'm talking about this costume firstly because this is my first ever YouTube video, so this is a really big learning curve for me. So I'm minimizing the complexity by talking about a costume I've already made instead of trying to film a process and getting overwhelmed. Secondly, I didn't really document the making of this costume at the time, so I think this is a good opportunity to get that information out there. I've seen a lot of people really struggle with the construction of the costumes from this film, and a few people have asked me how I did mine. So come along with me and I'll explain how I made it. I really like this film. It has such stunning visuals and music, and forgive me for the tangent, I can't help myself, I am going to talk about the music. At several moments throughout the film, the cinematic or non-diegetic music interacts and crosses over with music played by characters on the screen, the diegetic music. This creates a sense of diegetic slippage in the audiovisual medium, dissolving the barrier between character and audience, as if the fourth wall of the theatre is being permeated and broken. Are the characters aware that they're in a film, or are we drawn into the story as participants? This is kind of a signature of the collaborations between Joe Wright and Dario Marianelli, the absolute most affecting and effective example, in my opinion, being the Dunkirk beach scene in Atonement, with the hymn Dear Lord and Father of Mankind. Fun fact, I once had to sing that on BBC Radio, and I genuinely struggled to sing it properly because it's so strongly associated for me with that film, and I literally cannot watch Atonement because it gives me about 95 points of psychic damage, and singing this hymn elicited a physical reaction in my body which made it difficult to use proper technique. Like the music, I love how much storytelling is packed into the costumes of this film. Something they do really well is how they differentiate between country people and city people. It's set around the 1790s, so you see a lot of older people wearing older styles, and there's some really great wacky 1790s styles, especially in the ball scenes. Look at that hair! It's amazing! Because so much of the film is set in and around the home, I really like how the costumes and styling take cues from more informal looks. Here is Jenny at her sewing. I think this drawing probably inspired the hairstyling in this film, especially Lizzie's. So this costume specifically is one of my favourites because it says so much about Lizzie's character. She's wearing this informal sort of sleeveless petticoat, which reminds me of this watercolour of people eating breakfast. But under it, instead of a women's chemisette, she's wearing a men's shirt. It's her dad's! Lizzie is Mr. Bennet's favourite daughter, and I love how that relationship is subtly represented in this costume, if you know what to look for. It's really funny because I've been saying for a while that we are way overdue a new Pride and Prejudice adaptation, and I guess the monkey's paw curled because Netflix just announced theirs. I have not seen their Persuasion because I do not need to see my girl, autistic queen Anne Elliot, turned into a slapstick knockoff Bridget Jones. I will never forgive Netflix for causing the cancellation of Sarah Snook's adaptation of Persuasion. I will mourn Sarah Snook's Persuasion forever. Sarah Snook's Persuasion is my Roman Empire. Anyways, let's get back to Pride and Prejudice and how I made this costume. The first layer of the costume is the corset. And now I get to talk about another detail in this film's costuming that I really love. In one scene, the Bennet girls are getting ready for the Netherfield ball, and there's this gorgeous long tracking shot following Betsy the maid, with more of that diegetic slippage in the scoring that I am obsessed with. As she walks through the house, you can see the Bennet girls in their undies. And if you look really closely, you can see that Jane is the only one of the sisters with bust gussets in her corset. This makes perfect sense because she's the eldest sister, so of course she gets the newest fashions first. Gussets in corsetry start showing up around the 1790s, which is when this film is set. So I really love this little detail. All that being said, Lizzie is wearing a slightly older style of underwear, so I used the Augustus Stays pattern by Scroop. Stays being a period term for corsetry. I love this pattern. It comes in curvy and straight shape options, so you can choose your body type as well as your size, so the pattern needs a lot less adjusting. I'll put a link in the description for this and all the patterns and resources that I recommend. I made mine out of cotton twill with plastic boning and grosgrain binding. I often see tutorials for binding corsets of this era with bias binding. Don't do that. The reason people use bias binding instead of more historical options like, for example, linen tape, is because bias binding goes around a curve really easily. But what else does it do? It stretches. We don't want that. I really recommend grosgrain ribbon instead. It's strong, it doesn't stretch, it loves to go around curves, and it's also something that's found on extant historical corsetry of this period. Here's my absolute favourite 18th century corset held in the V&A. It's bound with silk grosgrain, and also here's my recreation of it. The second layer of this costume is the shirt. I used a linen with a really subtle stripe, which doesn't really show up on camera, I think, but it adds a little bit of extra visual interest. Honestly, this is because I originally made the shirt to wear in everyday life, but it still works for this costume. As it's a pretty standard Georgian men's shirt, I just followed a blog tutorial by Vincent Briggs, which I really recommend. And he also has an updated version of that tutorial with an accompanying YouTube video, so it's probably even better since I made mine. And now let's talk about the pinafore itself. I used a relatively coarse linen that I picked up in London. It was a little lighter than I wanted, so I decided to try out onion dyeing. I saved up my brown onion skins for a few weeks and I boiled them up following the instructions in this book, Fabric Dyeing and Printing by Kate Wells. This turned out pretty well and I managed to achieve the colour I was going for, but over time the natural dye started to fade. You can probably prevent this with heavy metal mordanting, but I didn't do that because I was lazy and I didn't want to buy anything. Eventually I over-dyed it with a synthetic dye from Rit, which has held its colour much better over time. If you want a more in-depth look at plant dyeing from someone who's better at it than me and less lazy, check out this video by Be Queer Make Stuff about dyeing wool with sumac berries. For the dress pattern, I used a Regency pattern and I modified it. This was honestly probably the wrong way around to do things. Because this film is set during a kind of transitional period in fashion, I really should have used a pattern from the earlier period and worked forward on account of the passage of time. Anyway, I found a pattern for a wrap front Regency gown and I modified it to have this V-neck centre front opening. I used a Regency gown because this pinny has a construction a lot like a round gown, which was the style of gown that was the predecessor to Regency gowns. Like I said, I probably should have gone in the opposite direction, and the only thing I'm not happy about with this costume is that the waist is just a little bit too high in the back, as it sits just above my natural waist. I probably could have combined a 1780s back and an 1800s front and come up with something a little bit better. Like a round gown, the bodice opens in the centre front, but the skirts open at the side seams. This is something I've seen cosplayers who aren't really into historical clothing get really confused by, but it made perfect sense to me as a Georgian fashion enjoyer. It's a little bit different from a 1780s and 90s round gown in that it doesn't have a pointed bodice, so in order to stop the skirt waistband from sagging, which would have been visible. One side of the bodice is stitched to the waistband. So unlike a classic round gown, it only opens at one side seam and it closes with a covered button. There's also a hook and bar in the center front to keep the open side of the waistband lying flat. I constructed this whole thing with Georgian sewing techniques and it's all sewn by hand. I didn't have to do that, but I was just in the mood to, and it was quite a fun project. This means I lined all the bodice pieces individually first, and then stitched those pieces together with something not dissimilar to a whip stitch. It's called an English stitch in the American Duchess Guide, but I'm sure it has other names in other books. In my experience, anytime something is named after a nationality, especially in textiles, it probably has about 5 other names. The skirt panels are all stitched together with mantua maker's seams. For the buttons I was probably more detailed than I needed to be. I created shanks with a buttonhole stitch which just keeps it slightly separated from the cloth. I used shell buttons for these because one time I bought 50 grams of shell buttons on eBay and that's a lot of shell buttons. They're really light. I'll never run out of 12mm shell buttons in my life. These will go to my descendants probably. I think I've said all I have to say about this costume's design and construction, so without further ado, here are some clips of it worn. Thank you so much for watching this video and for sticking around to the end. In the description you'll find links to all of the resources that I've mentioned. If you want to support what I do and help me make more videos, please remember to like this video and subscribe to my channel. It would really mean the world to me. I also have a coffee account, which I'll link below if you're so inclined to buy me a coffee. I'm trying to finish a PhD this year, so I'm chugging coffee like water at the moment. I'm currently working on my first vlogged sewing project, which is a pair of late medieval hoods, and I'm planning on making Lizzie's Pemberley gown from the same Pride and Prejudice adaptation this year, which I also plan on vlogging. I'm also planning more of these sort of recap style videos of a couple of my Lord of the Rings costumes, which took a really long time to make. So if you're interested in any of that, please stay tuned. Thank you so much again for watching, and I'll hopefully see you next time. Bye!